All right, Dragon Door Isochain review. What are the pros, what are the cons? And more specifically, is this thing just an overly built, overly complicated gadget, or is it really a true game changer? Now on the surface, the idea of the Isochain makes a lot of sense, because with isometrics, this is a training discipline that's been used for a very long period of time and to great results, but the results often quickly peter out and we run into limitations because we don't have a quantifiable metric of how much force you're putting into it. Without that quantifiable metric, one, it's hard to track progress, but more importantly, it's harder to program it like regular strength training. Things like periodization and programs and all these other things are largely inaccessible without quantifiable metrics. So that's been a big Achilles heel with isometric training. So the idea sounds really simple. Put a force gauge into the handle or along the chain or something that tells you how much force you're applying to that handle. Now you have a quantifiable metric. Now you solve all of those problems, right? No. See, that's what I did when I first got the Isochain. It was like, oh, okay, great. We've got a quantifiable force metric that I can use to start pushing and pulling and looking at it and stuff. And I quickly came to the realization that having that force gauge in the handle is a great idea in theory, but personally, I found it to be atrociously bad in application for several reasons. The first is, a lot of times I can't look at that screen. I can't really see it very well. Sometimes it's even behind me for some of the exercises. So in order for me to gaze and look at that screen or something around, I've got to compromise my technique. I'm like craning my neck around or arching my back or moving my hands where I don't really want them to be. So most of the time I can't or don't want to be looking at that screen. A second thing is trying to fixate your attention on a screen while you're pushing your muscles as hard as possible is a real big pain in the butt. Anybody who's a competitive athlete, like me from my bike racing days, knows that anything that requires just the smallest amount of attention away from your actual physical ability is an unwelcome distraction. Like when I was bike racing, if I got a song in my head, forget it, I was not riding as well as I could. So trying to fixate your gaze on something, that's kind of like doing hill sprints and reading a Where's Waldo book at the same time. You're multitasking with your mind, when if you really want to make the most of this training, you need 100% of your concentration on your muscles, not on a screen or a force gauge or something like that. And it's even worse with isometrics, because not only are you potentially watching a force gauge, but you're also having to watch a clock, because we need to know how long you're holding it for. So trying to split your attention around a force gauge and a clock and your muscles, it's just this gobbledygook that means it's actually going to compromise your training. So when people say, well, should I DIY this with like a crane scale or something, I was like, don't even bother. Don't even mess with quantification. Just do something like the ISO trainer from WorldFit or my ISO loop or something like that, and just forget about all this so you can focus 100% on contracting the muscles as hard as possible, because that's going to be the best way to go about it. So personally, I found that real-time in-exercise feedback is largely overhyped. It's not worth it. It's not worth the weight and the cost and all that sort of thing. But that's certainly not where the Isochain ends. Because after I started to really get used to using the real electronics of the Isochain, I realized this thing is on a whole nother level beyond quantifiable feedback during an exercise. You see, the Isochain has 5 modes to it. So it's not just about getting a quantifiable amount, it's what you're doing with those numbers that makes or breaks your training. Now, out of those 5 modes, 4 of them have buttons here on the left side of the screen. The 5th one is their feedback mode, which is basically you're not in a mode, it's just telling you what force you're putting into that handle. But these 4 modes are the things that make the Isochain so incredibly effective from anything else you'll ever use. Trying to fixate your attention on a force meter and a clock and your muscles is not the practical way to go about isometric training. It just does not work as well as it could or it should be. And that's why Dragon Door, when they designed this thing, they did something that I originally thought was kind of just quirky. Instead of just giving you a number, they give you auditory feedback in the form of beeps. And these beeps happen once every second. That single thing of the auditory beeps is by far the most important thing about the Isochain. And here's why. See, those audio beeps you can set with the first 2 modes, load mode and timed mode. Now, load mode is exactly like loading up a barbell with plates. You can set it for a certain amount of weight, say like 50 pounds, for example. So when you apply force into the handle, it's not going to do anything until you meet or exceed that 50 pounds of force, at which case it'll start beeping at you every second on the second. Beep, beep, beep. Basically, it's saying you're producing enough force. And on a fundamental level, this is exactly how weight training works. See, when you lift a weight, you don't know how much tension you're actually producing in your muscles. The weight on the bar is only correlated to muscle tension. It's not causing it. You're contracting your muscles to use the weight. The weight doesn't contract your muscles. So when you attempt to lift a weight, you're getting feedback from the kinetics of the bar or that weight. You're saying, am I producing enough tension in my muscles? And if you're not lifting it. And if you are, you start lifting it. Now, when you lift up something against gravity, you're not producing that much force. If you have a 50-pound weight and you're moving it against gravity, you're producing an excess of 50 pounds. And when you lower the weight, you're producing less than 50 pounds. Now, that's why weightlifting works, is it tells you if you're producing enough tension in your muscles relative to the resistance that you have set. So with the Isochain, when you set that load, you're literally doing the exact same thing, saying, I need to produce enough tension to meet or exceed that number. And when you do, it gives you that audio feedback. You don't even have to count. Like the other mode, the timed mode, you can set the time. So it will count the beeps and give you a 2-second beep on the very last count. So you don't even have to count. You can just go 100% concentrated effort, put in as much as you can into that bar, and it will tell you if it's enough and if it's long enough. And ultimately, that's the information we really need to know about isometric training. Now, the time and load modes alone would make this thing a game changer. But there's two other modes that are really worth visiting. These are the max mode, and these are the average modes. Now, when I first started using it, I looked at these as kind of just a novelty thing, because when you're done with a set, you can then hit the max and see what your maximum amount of force was. And you can have the average and see what the average amount of force was. And it's like, oh, okay, that's kind of neat. What these max and average buttons do is they actually double your chances of having progressive overload from one workout to the next. As you see, when we're strength training, if you want to make progress, you have to have as many different areas to improve upon as possible. This is why one of the biggest mistakes with people when they do calisthenics, and their only game plan is to do more push-ups. That's one area of progression. Now that's fine, but the more limited your progressive elements are, the quicker you're going to hit a plateau and the harder it's going to be to break that plateau. That's why you've got reps, but it also helps to quantify and progress the amount of force or tension you're producing. So weight and reps, right? We've got two things now. And that's very good because you can progress reps, you can progress weight, you can kind of seesaw this thing. If one thing's not improving, you can improve the other. Now you've got options to keep yourself moving forward. And while two things is great, what the max and averages do is they've now given you two more ways to make progress from one workout to the next, because you can track the amount of average tension you've produced in a set and the max you've had. So for example, a lot of times when I'm working with clients with this, I'll still give them the same load and I'll give them the same amount of time, but I'll track and be like, wow, your average has gone up by 10 pounds, or you just spiked up and were able to accomplish 15 more pounds of force than you did last week. So we have knowledge of, are we producing more total tension or a total amount of tension in strength? So you can see you're actually getting stronger even though your weight and reps are exactly the same. Now the real question is it right for you? Because it's like any tool. It's right for some people, not so right for others. And that's why in a previous video I said that it depends on what you're using isometrics for. If you're someone who uses isometrics, they're dabbling in it, or if you're using it kind of as a neuromuscular proficiency tool, like we use in grind style calisthenics, just wake up the muscles, get them working together, you don't need this at all. It's completely unnecessary. It's interesting, it's cool, but if you're using other modes of strength training with quantifiable metrics like calisthenics or free weights and stuff, I don't think it's going to be worth the cost and the size and all that other sort of thing. You're much better off with just the ISO trainer or the ISO loop for that application. But if you're using or want to use isometrics as kind of the meat and potatoes of your strength training program, this thing is definitely the way you want to go. So that's my initial review, my initial thoughts. It's still been only a few weeks. I'm still uncovering the layers on what this thing really is and what it really does for strength training. But let me know if you have thoughts and questions down below as always. And thank you so much for watching this lengthy review. Till then, be fit, live free.